So, as with other research methods, qualitative interviews have certain challenges associated with them and certain criticism of them, which may come from perhaps other qualitative researchers, possibly out of concern for interview quality or methodological quality, or it may come out from outside the qualitative field, perhaps from quantitative researchers or those who follow more positivistic scientific approaches, who are more generally critical of interviews as a method of data collection. So the first one is that interviews do require a lot of time to plan, conduct, and analyze. It takes time to come up with the questions that comprise the interview schedule, to perhaps solicit feedback on the questions, or to pilot them with some practice participants in order to learn more about how the schedule actually functions in practice. And then, of course, to make revisions. Conducting the interview itself may take around 30 to 60 minutes for a single interview. Possibly, if you're doing more interviews, you may do several rounds of interviews, which will obviously take more time. And this final stage is perhaps the most time-consuming. It's necessary to transcribe the data from the spoken form to the written form, which can be quite time-consuming, especially if you've done more than one round of interviewing. If you've interviewed your participants in their first language, which is not English, it could mean as well that it will mean that you'll need to translate the information into English if you want to quote extracts in the dissertation report, which is obviously time-consuming. Secondly, it may be necessary, depending on who your participants are, to navigate gatekeepers, what they're called gatekeepers, in order to access potential participants. An obvious example might be if you're seeking to interview pupils in school settings, you would need to go through and gain permission from, for example, the head teacher, the principal. And this can cause problems because, or can be time-consuming because they may request information about what your research study is, which you'll need to provide, and in layperson's terms as well. They may have certain conditions that they want to impose on your research, which cause you to change the design of your research. And most seriously, they may deny you access. So it may be impossible actually to gain access to the people that you want to speak to, which is obviously very, very serious. Another criticism of interviews is that they're difficult to do well. So it's challenging trying to maintain focus of the interview to ensure that it flows in the way that you want to by following your research your interview schedule and your interview questions, because obviously participants will likely say things that might send you into a tangent. You might hear things that you want to follow up, but then the course of the conversation has moved on to something else. It might be quite difficult to bring participants back to something that you want to explore further. It's also entirely possible to write questions that can lead participants into a particular conclusion rather than being more open-ended. And then, of course, there's the issue of rapport. So the better the relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee, the more likely they are to provide information which is going to be insightful. Fourthly, and this comes from outside of this criticism comes from outside qualitative research, and that is the doubt from quantitative researchers that interviewees provide reliable testimony. So there's this criticism that perhaps participants in interviews are perhaps maybe not being truthful, or have certain biases, certain perspectives that are unique to them, or that the interviewer, her or himself, is contaminating the interview by their presence because the researcher has certain biases and perspectives. And of course, how the interviewer asks the questions, the order of the questions, the use of probes, all affect the direction and flow of the interview, which some quantitative researchers criticize as not being objective or not being reliable. A more extreme form of this criticism is that semi-structured or qualitative interviews can be considered soft, or that anything goes. They're not methodologically rigorous enough to compare with perhaps positivist or quantitative research methods. Countering these claims, qualitative researchers they have to show how their interviews or the process of interviewing, the designing of the schedule, the conducting of the interviewing, and the analysis was done rigorously, requiring the researcher to be quite open and transparent about what they did, to provide much detail about what happened, for example, in the design of the schedule or the particular context in which the interview took place, and also to reflect on their own role in the interview and how their role and how they impacted on the interview itself. And finally, this final one is something to be careful of, and this comes from other qualitative researchers, and that's the importance of avoiding the exploitation of the interviewee, or called othering. And this stems from the inherent power difference in interviews between the interviewer, the researcher who has the power. They have the schedule, they have the ability to interpret the interview and to provide the final truth on what happened in the interview in the research report, relative to the participants, who are considered much less powerful vis-a-vis the researcher. So it can end up in situations where perhaps the researcher inadvertently imposes certain false perspectives on the interviewee. Perhaps they misinterpret the interviewee, or they could perpetuate certain stereotypes. So it's quite important to consider during data analysis, to rethink, when looking at the transcript, what are the participants, what were they trying to say, what was the meaning behind what they were trying to say. And something some researchers do to ensure that they avoid this is called member checking, or a member check. And this is where the interpretations of what happened in an interview, like a written record, a short written summary, is shared with the participant for them to have a look, have a read, and to give feedback on, and potentially say whether this is a truthful or not interpretation of what actually happened in the research, in the semi-structured or qualitative interview.